Hey there, Emmanuel here from WebDevFuel, and in this video we're going to go over the idea that LLMs are going to stagnate the whole web development industry as a whole. And we'll be going through this question to sort of understand how this might happen. Would React succeed if it were created today in the LLM era? So before React, there was jQuery, and obviously there were other technologies around the block. There was Angular, there is always also Vue.js, but the transition as a whole, if we think about it as the most popular technology, happened from jQuery to React. So a lot of people were using jQuery before, and then React introduced this new model of rendering pages that sort of revolutionized everything. And now React is the most popular technology to build UIs on the front end. And while some of you might disagree, and there are different people with different opinions when it comes to this, most web developers on the front end would say that in general, React is a better model than jQuery, and it makes things a lot easier. So it was in some ways a much better model for us to use to build UIs today. And this didn't happen overnight. A lot of things needed to be in place for this to happen. But eventually, React became the new thing that all web developers nowadays use to build UIs. And the question is, would LLMs allow this transition to even happen? Because if we think at the end of the day, LLMs don't really think about what technology is better to use for a particular end goal. The LLMs are only concerned with what's most popular. And while this might seem a simplification of what LLMs actually do, at the end of the day, they only try to predict what the next word is going to be, or if we give them a certain input, they try to predict what the output is. And as a result, they are almost always going to prefer giving you a more popular technology rather than trying to understand the nuances of your web application, what you want to do exactly, and stuff like that. And also because these LLMs were trained on a lot of data from the internet, and React is currently the most used front-end UI library, especially for new projects. The LLMs sort of understand that React is the first thing that you want to give to someone when they ask how to build something related to a UI, especially when it comes to a framework. So if we ask for a framework, the most likely outcome is going to be a React Hello World, for example. And the problem here is that the LLM is not an actual web developer. If I were to ask you, for example, you have, let's say, 3 or 4 years of experience with React, and I introduce you to Svelte. I would say that you would be able to transition to Svelte, not everything, but you would be able to be productive with it in 1 week, 2 weeks. You would be able to start building stuff with it with almost no problem. And I wouldn't need to constantly remind you to use Svelte. Remember that we are using Svelte inside this project. Or if I were to, let's say, ask you to build another project that is related to this one, I wouldn't need to give you instructions all over again. You already would know what Svelte is. But in the case of LLMs, since they are trained and they have sort of a stop when they stop being trained, if new things are introduced into the web development industry, then in this case, it becomes much, much harder for us to use the LLMs and for those LLMs to be able to actually take advantage of these improvements. Because, like I said previously, a lot of you might disagree, but in general, React was an improvement when compared to jQuery. But if we had LLMs at that time, I think that we wouldn't be able to so easily transition from a older technology to a new technology, because a lot of developers nowadays go to the LLM and ask the LLM to do things. And this is one thing that teams have to take into account, into consideration. Is the LLM able to produce code for this technology? And not only is this technology actually more productive, are we able to actually build a better app, and so on and so on. Like I said, But LLMs don't actually care about what's better or worse, only what's popular, because they're trained to predict the most likely response. And this means that new technologies will have a harder time being adopted. And this is a problem because we don't want to stagnate our whole industry. We don't want programmers or other industries to be stagnated. And if we rely only on the LLMs, or if we mostly, let's say, rely on the LLMs to write code for us, then we will not be able to take advantage of new technologies. Let's say that a brand new UI framework comes out today, and it is actually better than everything else out there. I might want to use it, but if I choose to use that new UI framework, then I'll essentially need to say, okay, I don't want to use an LLM. I'm going to have to write everything manually because the LLM either doesn't have any kind of training, or I need to provide the context to the LLM constantly, which becomes a problem when the context becomes bigger. So if we have a big project with a lot of files, a lot of lines of code, then it is not as simple as I'm going to send this entire context to the LLM and the LLM will be able to understand. There are problems when it comes to sending the entire context of our code base. And this again becomes a very much a problem if we want to have new stuff, new technologies, or even things that already existed. Let's say the transition from class components into hooks. I also think that it would be much harder to have that transition from class component into hooks because, again, a lot of web developers would want to rely on the LLMs to write the code for them. They would ask the LLM, write me a to-do list application. The LLM would do it, but um, all the training would be based on the class components, and a lot of years would need to go by for the LLMs to start adopting this technology that was already released a lot of years ago. A few examples of these are the TanStack Start, the TanStack Form, and also Svelte 5 runes. I've seen a couple of videos from other YouTubers where they said that they tried to prompt the LLMs to generate Svelte 5 code, and the LLMs simply didn't understand what they were doing. Because Svelte 5 was released recently, I'm not really sure how long ago, but I would say not much longer than a year ago. And because of this, the LLMs were mostly trained on code before runes. So if you try to ask it to generate code with runes, then it will have a hard time doing it unless you provide the entire context, for example, of the documentation, because it was not trained on this. And like I said previously, an even worse scenario would be to have a completely new way of doing things that hasn't yet been adopted. And then we won't be able to progress as an industry because most web developers will be using LLMs or heavily relying on them. And this will come into the equation of should I choose this technology or not. And then these new ways, these better ways of doing things will be ignored, or web developers, programmers in general, will spend a lot of time actually trying to improve things to create better tools, whether that's for the developers themselves or for the end user, and those tools will just be ignored. As an example of this, I told here ChatGPT to give me a hello world with TanStack Start. And it says here, sure, here's the minimal hello world example, and it says to run this command npx create TanStack latest. And then after doing this, I need to install, run dev command, and then it says here, edit your first route. In the project structure, routes are defined in the source routes folder. But if I move back to the terminal, where I've already went ahead and run those commands, we can take a look here at the project, and you'll be able to see that this package.json only has the TanStack React router and the React router dev tools. Why is that? That is because ChatGPT here gave us the wrong command. If we take a look at the GitHub repo, create TS router app, as you can see, we have here three different commands: create TS router app, create start app, and also create TanStack. And this is only going to create a very minimal web application here that uses Vite and only includes the React router and the React router dev tools. And it doesn't include the other packages that would require us to actually run TanStack Start, like for example, React Start, React router. This one actually we have it. And then we would also need here this Vinxi package to be able to run things on the server, if I'm not mistaken. But the point here is that we asked ChatGPT to give us a hello world, and not because the LLM per se doesn't have this ability to give us a very simple hello world, but because the LLM was not trained on Stack Start. This is a very brand new technology. This is something recent. As you can see, it is still at version 0. And for this reason, it doesn't have this training data. Now let's imagine that TanStack Start is actually better than, for example, next.js for building web applications with React that also have server-side rendering. I'm not saying this is the case, but let's imagine that's actually the case. If we were to try to use this today, we would have a much harder time doing so than if we were to use next.js. And if we would say that, let's imagine that this was released back in 2015 or 2012, then the adoption of a new technology like TanStack Start would be much easier, again, because we wouldn't need to rely on these LLMs to write code for us, but instead we would be able to come here to the documentation, new YouTube videos and new articles would start coming out, showing us how to do things. We would be able to read through the documentation, the GitHub issues, the GitHub repo, and very easily transfer all of the knowledge that we have from next.js into TanStack Start. And because we are humans, because we have this ability to actually process all of this information and transfer this context from next.js, for example, into a different technology and very easily adopt to new situations, these kinds of technologies would essentially be able to get popularity a lot faster, and we would actually be able to improve the web development ecosystem as a whole. Again, I'm not saying that this will actually happen for sure, but there are a lot of signs showing us that this will be the case, and there are small cases where we can see this today. Like I said, Svelte 5 runes are something that is still very hard to be able to use with LLMs because they are trained on previous versions of Svelte, and this might be a problem in the future. So what I recommend is that you try to, as much as you can, still write code manually without the help of the LLMs. Yes, you might go to an LLM to ask a question here or there, to try to learn something, or even to do some kind of autocomplete for you. But in general, we should try to actually choose a technology based on its merits, if it is actually a good technology, and not on its popularity, or if the LLM is able to write code with it or not. With this being said, I hope this video was helpful to you, and I'll see you on the next one.